Hey everyone, this is Roaming Millennial, and joining me today I have a very special guest, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. He's a clinical psychologist and tenured university professor at University of Toronto, and lately he's found himself at the center of quite a bit of controversy surrounding his opposition to Bill C-16, which in its most basic form, I guess, is meant to extend anti-discrimination protection to gender identities, but that he says threatens freedom of speech. So his video originally on his channel critiquing the bill has become quite popular, as has a filmed video of him confronting or being confronted by a social justice warrior at a protest at the university. And for everyone who's not caught up, all the links to the videos will be down in the description. So Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I guess before we get started, I reached out to everyone on social media that follows me and asked, what they wanted to hear from you. And I think the number one thing people wanted from this was to have you know how much we support you and how much we appreciate what you're doing. The word hero is thrown around a lot today, but I think it's actually really fitting in this case. And you're the first person I think we've seen in a while, especially from academia, coming out confronting these issues and talking about freedom of speech and individual rights. So just thank you for everything that you're doing, and I'm sure it hasn't been easy for you.
The alternative isn't easy either, and
right.
Here's something that's very much worth knowing about life, is that whatever you're doing or not doing has a cost, and it's really easy to forget about the cost of what you're not doing. That's a big mistake. And when I first made these videos, of course, I had no idea what the net impact would be, but I decided that, and I've decided this for a very long time, that the risks that accrue to you for speaking the truth are so much more minimal than the risks that accrue to you from deceiving yourself and other people, that they're not even in the same universe. And I actually understand that, because I've studied how deception and deceit and twisted language corrupt societies into murderous and genocidal entities. I've studied that for 40 years. And decades ago, I decided that I was going to do my best to speak the truth as clearly as I could formulate it, and then to let whatever happened happen. That's a kind of faith, the idea of religious faith is not a particularly popular idea among intellectuals in the modern world, but that's partly because they don't really understand what it means. So here's an example of faith. So you say, well, if you speak the truth, imagine that the universe is constituted in a fundamentally positive way. Perhaps it is and perhaps it isn't. We don't know, but imagine for a moment that it is, and imagine that the only way that you could get access to that positive element is by telling the truth. And so you can decide that you're going to run your life like that, and instead of using your language to manipulate people and to get what you want, you can use your language just to represent what you believe to be true, and to listen to others while you're doing it, and then to watch and see what happens. And I would say that's what I'm doing right now. It's that, my job is in peril, I would say. At least it appears that way at the moment, and has for several weeks. But I have no idea what the outcome of this is going to be. And I believe wholeheartedly that if I'm very careful with what I say, and if I listen to everyone that's responding to me, and I try to formulate my arguments in an increasingly articulate way, that this will turn out the best that it can turn out. And
right.
That's what I'm doing. So, and we'll see how that works.
Well, I guess touching on that, something that I think I know a lot of people, including myself, want to know is, and you mentioned it a little bit briefly, what has been the net effect for you, since you've released the original video on your YouTube channel, and then, following the protest that you're at sort of blowing up, you've had television appearances and interviews. How have people reacted to your position in terms of, the university, your colleagues, and your students?
Okay, well, so I do all my teaching from January to May, so it's had no impact on my undergraduate teaching. My graduate students, who I have 3 graduate students at the moment as well as a postdoc, they're firmly behind me. I've had thousands of letters of support from people, and very few letters of criticism. I think the letters that have been directed to my Gmail account are 100 to 1 in favor of what I'm saying. and I would say half of them are 2 to 3 pages long and very well thought through and very heartfelt. And people are saying that, many people are saying that they've become desperate desperate as a consequence of observing the wave of political correct censorship that's been sweeping across the West, and that they were losing hope, which seems, I suppose, somewhat dramatic, but that's what people have been writing. The Post Media Group, which is an organization or a conglomeration of 100 newspapers in Canada, came out firmly in support of me a day or two ago. I would say 95% of the comments on YouTube are positive. And I've ignited an absolute firestorm of political controversy across Canada, and also in the United States and in Europe and Australia. And so, that's basically unimaginable. But it does, I would say, point to the seriousness of the issues that confront people right now.
Right. And something that's been asked, because I think, a lot of the people who are following you are actually American. So what is the current state of free speech in Canada specifically, and how does it compare to what's going on in the United States right now?
I'd say it's very similar. I mean, look, Canadian universities, all things considered, are not as politically correct as American universities, despite what's been happening at the University of Toronto campus. This was partly precipitated by changes in legislation at the provincial, say the state, or the federal level. But the threats to free speech are identical across the two countries, and also, I would say, in Europe and Australia. The same thing is happening all across the Western world. And the best specific example of that, I would say right now, is the anti-misgendering laws that have been put in place in New York City, where it's now a crime punishable by a fine of up to $250,000 for refusing to refer to someone or failing to refer to someone by their so-called preferred pronoun, and where New York State has now declared 31 different gender identities worthy of protection by that sort of draconian law. So it's the same issue everywhere. And it's indicative of I really believe it's indicative of a fundamental fight for the foundation of Western civilization. I do believe that.
Right. And if I can just play devil's advocate for a second, something that I've heard a lot from the social justice side of things, and, from the people who are sort of critics, of your videos and of your views, is that they see this very much as them defending transgender rights. Like, I know from, people who, like you and me, who are sort of more about free speech, this is about free speech rights, but for them, it's very much about the rights for transgender people. So what would you say to, an anti-discrimination bill that perhaps was more specific, less vague, and didn't target speech so vaguely? Would that be something that you're in support of, or do you think the anti-discrimination laws have just, gone too far?
Well, we should take the transgender issue apart a bit, because there's a lot to it. And I mean, to me, it's in some sense only a historical accident that this argument tended to center on the rights of transgender people. I mean, the line that I drew in the sand, so to speak, could have been drawn in any number of other battles over similar issues. But let's look at the transgender issue for a minute. Okay, so the first thing that we might note is that the transgender activists who claim to be speaking on behalf of the transgender population actually have no legal or ethical right to be speaking for them. They just say that they're speaking for them. Now, the reason that I'm bringing that up, and the reason that I've learned that, is because I've had at least, it's got to be 15 letters from transgender people now supporting my stance. And one of the things that I've come to realize more clearly is that the transgender community as a whole doesn't have any problem with gendered pronouns. In fact, quite the opposite. So the typical, let's say that the canonical transgendered person is someone who experienced gender dysphoria in childhood, and that was sufficiently persistent, so they decided to go the route of biological transformation, partial or fully. Those people, so if they're male to female transsexuals, they have no problem with he and she. What they have a problem with is the he or the she that they originated with. And so a male to female transsexual wants to be called she, and the female to male transsexual wants to be called he in the vast majority of cases. So perhaps 95% of the tiny minority of people who are transsexuals aren't in this argument in the way the transgender activists say they are at all. And then with all
Right.
these other categories, to me, a huge part of that is it's just flavor of the moment. We have no idea how many people there are who truly believe they don't fit somewhere on the continuum between male and female, or truly fit somewhere where they could be most rapidly identified as one or the other, but it's a very, very small percentage of people.
Right. So
And so,
you're talking specifically about those non-binary gender identities, the gender fluid, gender blender, whatever the cool
yeah,
kids are calling it right now.
they claim to be speaking for the transsexual community, and I see no evidence of
Right.
that at all. And then, assuming even that they were, they're making a proposition, right? So here's the proposition. There's two of them. One is that if you refer to someone by the pronoun of their choice, their life will be better. All right, I see no evidence for that. It's a proposition. Now, it could be true, but it could just as easily be false. And I actually think it will be false. And so here's why. So imagine that you're a non-binary transgender person and you're looking for a job. And you walk into your potential employer's office, carrying with you your demands to be addressed in a particular way by that boss and by all of your co-workers and by any customers that you might happen to serve. And that along with those demands is the threat of a very punitive lawsuit against anyone who makes a mistake addressing you, and then against the company for hiring anyone who makes a mistake addressing you. You really think that that's going to facilitate your easy acceptance into standard culture? How is that a plus? I just don't. So how is that gonna make it easier for people who have non-binary identities to find their place in society? Practically, it's an untenable solution. It's a horrifying solution.
And I personally, I agree with you. I don't think any real acceptance is done by legislation. I don't think you can't legislate someone into accepting something. But I guess on a more personal...
It has exactly the opposite effect, is that if you mandate acceptance, you foment hatred.
Mm-hmm.
Because people like to be forced.
I guess on a more personal level, something that I've had people leave comments about in my gender videos, and something that I'm sure you've had students or, critics approach you about, is that, regardless of any legislation or any punitive measures, if someone were to approach you, one-on-one and say, hey, these are my pronouns, I would really appreciate if you would use them, just as a matter of courtesy or respect, would you do that? Or, are people like you and us who refuse to use these pronouns, are we being overly difficult, because they don't see it as a big deal?
Look, like you, like me, are surrounded by 7 billion strangers.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so when I'm interacting with a stranger, I'm going to default to simple common usage because I don't have any choice. Like, almost none of those 7 billion people are special to me in a way that I could name or remember. And you have no right to demand of me that I mark you out in my memory or in my speech as somehow special. I don't care what the specialness is. Now, if I got to know you thoroughly and I trusted you and I could remember who you were because you'd been marked out in my memory and we had a relationship, it's hard to tell what I might be willing to do if I felt that it was in your best interest.
Mm-hmm.
But to request something like that of someone is unbelievably invasive. And it's especially the case when it's by no means the case that I would agree with you initially that that's actually in your best interest just because you think it is. People think all the time that things are in their best interest without knowing that they in fact are. And so it isn't a matter of common courtesy, and it's not a matter of simple kindness. Look, first of all, kindness is not the only principle that we need to use in order to regulate our interactions with one another. Or maybe it depends on how you define kindness. But you take the example of children. It's very frequently the case that if you're raising a child, you have to not do what that child wants. And in a manner that's often quite harsh and quite dismissive even of their feelings. But there's a reason you do it. The reason you discipline your children is so that they stop acting impulsively in a manner that will interfere with their capacity to adapt in the future, right? So partly what you're trying to do is socialize your child so that that particular person, young person, becomes happily accepted by other people. And you have to interfere with their free expression of feelings constantly and their demands for a particular kind of identity constantly. So no, I think it's a specious argument at every level of analysis. And the idea that I'm somehow not being compassionate because I won't accede to a particular kind of demand, I think is, it's an argument. It's an argument that can be put forth, but I think that fundamentally it's a weak argument. And I also think that there's no evidence whatsoever that it will produce the results that are claimed for the act.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a good point, because I do think, the people who are engaged in these gender politics, they are somewhat divorced from reality in a lot of ways, and how, mainstream people would treat them or accept them or, buy into their gender ideology. But with that being said, where do you think this gender binary, I guess, non-gender binary obsession that's kind of going on right now has come from? Because I haven't even been out of university that long, but I still feel like, this whole gender fluid otherkin thing wasn't as popular when I was in school.
No, I think it's part of this generalized assault on the fundamental categorical schemes of Western civilization. I believe that. So the fundamental axiom of the social justice warrior types is, there's a couple of them. One is that Western civilization is nothing but an oppressive patriarchy. And I should say something about that. Western culture is an oppressive patriarchy, but it's not nothing but an oppressive patriarchy. It's also the structure that gave rise to the most magnificent and free societies that human beings have ever inhabited. And it's only an oppressive patriarchy if you compare it to a hypothetical dreamer's utopia. Compared to, imagine there's 30 countries in the world that people who want to be free can actually live, and 150 that range from dreadful to absolutely torturous. It's like, if you compare Western civilization to the rest of the countries, we're doing pretty damn well. So to call us an oppressive patriarchy, in the absence of appreciation that as far as oppressive patriarchies go, we're pretty much at the top of the heap, is a dreadfully and ideologically predicated oversimplification. And it's driven not by any historical knowledge or economic analysis or anything like that. It's driven purely by resentment. And the social justice warrior types are resentful of anyone who's garnered any success or any status whatsoever by any means, and will do anything possible to pull those people down. So their idea of equity, and we've seen this occur in other societies, is that everyone will be absolutely equal when everyone has nothing in the rubble. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, because they'd be perfectly happy to inhabit the rubble as long as nobody had a better pile of rubble than they did.
So in your opinion, like this whole SJW thing, it definitely reeks of authoritarianism, I guess, is what
right
you're saying.
To the core, yes. Well, and it has its roots in the same ideological systems that produced the authoritarian catastrophes, especially the ones in the Soviet Union and Maoist China. This demand for absolute equity. And equity means, I just got the training material that the Human Resources Department at the University of Toronto is using to indoctrinate its employees. And they actually state straightforwardly in the training material, which is designed to, redress the unconscious bias of HR staff, that societies that don't produce equality of outcome are corrupt and oppressive. Now remember, that's equality of outcome. That's what they define as equity.
Not opportunity.
Not opportunity. In fact, they're getting brazen enough so they're not even making the claim that it's equality of opportunity anymore. They're going straight for equality of outcome. Now, we know what happens when societies go after equality of outcome. What happens is what happened in the Soviet Union. And I would say, look, to your readers, people often ask me what you should read if you want to become educated about such things. And if you really want to put yourself in a position where you're an articulate opponent of this kind of authoritarianism, you have to educate yourself. So you should read 1984 by George Orwell. You should read Road to Wigan Pier. That's also by George Orwell. Mm-hmm. And most particularly, you should read the Gulag Archipelago. That's Alexander Solzhenitsyn's masterwork. And he details how the radical demands for egalitarianism that were characteristic of the Marxist-Leninists in the early 20th century were transformed by logical necessity into the absolutely murderous policies of the Soviet Union. And, you know, in the Soviet Union, and I don't know how many of your watchers know this, but between 1919 and 1959, the Soviets destroyed somewhere between 20 and 50 million of their own people. So, for example, after the Soviets, in the 1920s, the Soviets decided that you could be guilty of class guilt, essentially. And so they made the presupposition that in the peasant communities in the Soviet Union, which were composed of people who mostly had been freed from serfdom only several decades earlier, there were some prosperous farmers. And so those would have been people who owned their own house and maybe were able to have a cow or two and some land and maybe hire someone. And they were responsible for the vast bulk of Soviet or pre-Soviet agricultural output. Well, when the Soviets took power, they defined that group as kulaks, K-U-L-A-K-S, and they unleashed the hounds on them. And so the intellectuals would go into Russian villages looking for revolutionaries and tell them that they could go after these prosperous peasants and steal everything they had, the wallpaper from their walls, all their food, all their belongings. And so the most resentful and violent and useless people in the villages surrounded the houses of the few people who were prosperous and productive, stole everything they had, raped all the women, packed them all into railway cars, shipped them off to Siberia, and killed them. And that was millions of people. And then the consequence of that was that Soviet-era agriculture plummeted. Agricultural output plummeted in the 1930s, and 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. And so the Soviets had to produce posters saying that it was wrong to eat your children. It was against the law in the Ukraine in the 1930s. So imagine that the harvesters had gone through the fields in the farms that were collectivized and gathered up all the grain, you know, the mechanical harvesters. And then imagine that some poor starving Ukrainian woman decided that she'd go out in the field after it was harvested on her hands and knees and pick up single grains of wheat so she could go feed her family. Well, the penalty for not turning those into the authorities was death.
Yeah.
Like, we've had this already.
If I could just stop you there. So, you know, you've been very critical of, you know, the authoritarian left. And something that I've noticed when talking to these social justice warrior types is that anyone who is a critic of them, automatically they label right-wing. But you're not even right-wing. If I understand correctly from one of your interviews, I think you said you were part of the NDP, which is, I guess, center-left. Is that right?
Well, that was when I was a kid. I mean, I haven't been politically involved since I was a kid because I turned to psychology to study the psychology of political belief. But, you know, specifying my political views is not easy because I don't think I am political. I think I'm fundamentally religious and
right.
And so
because there's this like I've noticed anytime you talk to a social justice warrior or someone who is part of the regressive left, there is an attempt to paint their beliefs as encompassing all of the left, and anyone else who disagrees with them is right wing. And I think, even though I personally don't really identify with the left myself, I think a lot of people who are, you know, liberal are actually some of the people who are most upset because you have these group of people that are claiming to speak for them and represent them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, our psychometric analysis of political correctness shows quite clearly that there's sort of a liberal type of politically correct person. And so they're characterized by high trait openness, which is the creativity dimension, and also by high agreeableness, which is, roughly speaking, the maternal dimension. But then there's PC authoritarians, and they're of a different type. And they're only linked together because they're both agreeable. Mm-hmm. But the PC authoritarians are by no means the friends of the PC liberals. And eventually, you know, if the PC types would dominate completely, then they would fractionate. And the PC authoritarians would go after the PC liberals. That's already happening. And the left is also not, as you point out, is not a homogenous group. And so one of the things that's been quite interesting to me is that I've received many, many letters from people who I would say are actually on the radical left, supporting me because their radical left positions are no longer politically correct, and that means they're not allowed to express them. And so one of the things that's happening right now in the United States, for example, is that the equity warriors and the Title IX warriors are going head-to-head with each other because their claims aren't the same. So, and you're seeing a split between the feminists and the trans activists. because the feminists aren't very happy that all the gains that have been made by women and all the institutions that have been put in place, let's say, to protect women and to facilitate their development, have now been thrown open to anyone who claims female identity just as a consequence of a whim. And many of the feminists, like Germaine Greer, for example, a very famous feminist, is not very happy with the idea that being a woman has now become reduced to someone's instantaneous subjective choice. And so the left is starting to, and this often happens with radical movements, is that radicals produce children that eat them. That happens all the time. And that's what's happening on the left. So, yeah, so the idea that these, well, yeah.
Okay, so if we can talk about, your I guess your academic work a little bit right now. So people like me who are sort of on the outside looking in academia right now, it very much seems like everyone, students and university professors, have drunk the social justice Kool-Aid. Personally, I like to hope that these people are just a loud, outspoken minority. But in your, from your experience, what is, and even people you've taught, what have they thought about the whole social justice movement? Not beyond the pronoun issue, just as a whole, have they bought into it?
So first, the latest statistics indicate that 1 in 5 social scientists identifies as a Marxist. So they're not, and that's not my stats. Those are stats that are easily available online, and they're reliable. So they're not a tiny minority, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. And so there's a very powerful politically correct faction, let's say, among academics, both in the humanities and the social sciences. It's less pronounced in the sciences. In fact, there's some indication that the higher your IQ as an academic, the less likely you are to adopt a PC position. But so the physicists are the least politically correct of all of the people at the university.
Right.
But
why do you think that? Why do you think that is? Because I mean, here you're a professor who, standing up for the right to freedom of speech, and all of a sudden that's somehow controversial now. So, we've seen social justice movements become popular in media, television, movies, things like that. But what is it about academia that's been so attractive to these social justice warrior types?
How about subsidized salaries? How would that be? So, and I'm serious about that, because the thing is that the PC ideology isn't something that would enable you to make a living outside of the protected halls of academia. And what's happened for various reasons is that governments and private institutions alike have subsidized these intensely political activists in universities ever since the 1960s. And so we've happened to produce a very large number of them. I did some back of the envelope calculations, and I might be off. I'm not claiming that they're particularly accurate, but they're kind of in the ballpark. I figure the universities have produced anywhere between 300,000 and 3 million hyper-committed and well-trained radical left-wing political activists in the last 20 years. And so that's beginning to be a lot of people. And, people might say, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. It's like, go look for yourself. Go online and look up a dozen women's studies websites and see what they say. They all say the same thing. Western culture is an oppressive patriarchy that has to be overthrown by whatever means necessary. And if you come to if you come and enroll in our program, we'll teach you how to do that. And it's an integral part of the political activism, is an integral part of the studies. Now, with regards to intelligence, it's like, well, the more intelligent you are, roughly speaking, the more detail in which you can see the world, and the more variables that you can handle simultaneously in your thinking. And ideology is very attractive to people who, frankly speaking, aren't that bright, because it gives them a very understandable solution to every problem. And then you can add to that a certain amount of moral corruption, and in fact a substantial amount of moral corruption, because it enables people to feel like they're decent moral people, which is, by the way, something that's very hard to be, merely by applying the PC algorithm. And the PC algorithm, the game, is identify a domain of human activity, whatever it happens to be, any domain of human activity, number of records produced or books written or money generated or or authority in position or popularity. I don't care what it is. Facility at children's sports, whatever. Note that some people are doing comparatively well and some people are doing comparatively poorly. Define the people who are doing comparatively well as perpetrators and the people who are doing comparatively poorly as victims. Announce your support for the victims and trumpet your moral superiority and vent your resentment and hatred on the conveniently identified perpetrators. And then repeat that forever. It requires no thought. You can teach a university student how to do that in about 2 hours. You can indoctrinate them into being professional at doing that. Certainly, our recent research indicates that one politically correct course is enough to significantly affect someone's political beliefs. Mm-hmm. So having taken any kind of seminar or course that's associated with social justice is an effective way of pulling gullible young people into the cause.
And, that's a good point, and something that at least, people who are, I guess, sort of part of the anti-SJW community, one comparison that's made a lot is that, this extreme feminism or the extreme trans activists, they very much take their political activism like a religion. So, everything you've just mentioned, it sounds very much like this is a complete ideology to these people.
It's a secular religion. That is what right. It is. And it's an ideology. Like religious systems, if they're genuine, religious systems are evolved systems of thinking. They're not constructed systems of thinking. And that's very complicated. I can't go into that, but if you're interested in that, you can watch my Maps of Meaning videos on my YouTube channel. I've got about 40 hours of lectures per year on this topic, as well as the book I wrote. But what an ideology does essentially is parasitize a more fundamental religious mode of conceptualization. And so an ideology presents half a religious story, but it has enough power because it's half a religious story to still grip people by the soul. And look, people get gripped by religious stories all the time. They just don't know it. So for example, all the recent superhero movies that attract so much attention and that cost so much money to produce, those are all religious stories. They're basically hero myths of one form or another. And because our culture has become very radically secularized, we get almost all of our religious mythology through popular entertainment. I mean, look at the Avengers stuff. I mean, some of the characters in those stories are literal gods. So Thor and Loki are literal gods, and Thor and Loki are the Norse equivalent to Christ and Satan, right? They're the hostile brothers. Mm-hmm. And Odin is equivalent to God the Father. I mean, this is all being played out. Star Trek is the same thing. Star Wars is the same thing. Well, ideologies parasitize on a more fundamental and evolved religious substructure of belief, and they take half the story and present it as if it's the whole story. And it's very attractive to people, deeper grounding in a sophisticated and well fleshed out and symbolically rich metaphysical landscape. So it's a consequence, as Nietzsche said, it's a consequence of the death of God. You blow out the religious substructure of Western culture. You leave people adrift. They look for anything to cling to, and ideologues come along and offer them part of the wreckage and say, well, look, this will keep you afloat. And people think, well, that's better than sinking. But they don't know what it would be like to be in a real boat, or shall we say a real ark. So,
and I get going off of that, what do you think that we can do to sort of help combat this changing tide toward political correctness? Because just as regular people, not academics like yourself, not scholars who are writing these papers and these books, but in our everyday lives, or through maybe activism that we can take, what can we do?
Well, the first thing you can do, I would say, read. I put up a list today on, if you go to jordanbpeterson.com, I put a list of what I regard as required reading. It's required 20th century reading. So you have to do the damn reading, because otherwise you can't formulate your arguments in any articulate manner. And so you want to do the reading because it'll sort out your psyche. It'll be very good for you psychologically, even though the books that I put up there are absolutely terrifying. They're absolutely terrifying. One is The Rape of Nanking, that talks about what the Japanese soldiers did in China in World War II, and another is called Ordinary Men, and it's about the transformation of a police battalion into Nazi soldiers who were taking pregnant women out in fields and stripping them and shooting them in the back of the head. And they're horrifying, horrifying books. And so they make very difficult reading, but they educate you, and you need to be educated. And because education is one of the things that protects people against tyranny. And so then the other thing is that you have to object, and you have to do that in an articulate manner as best you can. Like, you have to allow yourself to make mistakes in argumentation, because everybody starts out as a neophyte. But there are going to be policies in your workplace that you find oppressively restrictive. There are going to be pieces of legislation that are passed in your local, at the municipal levels and upwards from that. And there are going to be policies that affect the way that your children are taught, because the social justice warriors are invading the schools like you can't believe. I mean, in one of the Canadian provinces now called Alberta, which is actually quite a conservative province, children are being introduced at a very young age to the gender unicorn. And the gender unicorn is this sort of animated character that teaches them that gender identity is entirely fluid, and that they are whoever they think they are at the moment. And so they're in there indoctrinating kids like mad. And so the thing to do is, every chance you get, you have to object to it with every political weapon at your disposal. Now, one of the things we're going to do, we're doing this right now, is set up a website. It's about 2/3 completed, where people will be able to upload policy documents that they regard as intensely politically correct. And we want people to upload the documents, so those could be documents at the local institutional level or at the legal level, doesn't matter, every level throughout society. We want the documents uploaded, and we want people to identify the authors of the documents. We'll make their names public along with their email addresses, and we got to flood them with letters and objections, and flood them and their bosses and the people that supervise them. We have to identify the people who are responsible for this. We have to pull them out as individuals, and we have to make them responsible for their actions. I don't see any other way of dealing with it.
And that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people probably share views that are very similar to yours, but I think what's stopping a lot of people from being more vocal like you are in their everyday lives is the fact that these views have become so unpopular. People who come out as anti-PC, anti-SAW, there have been people that have been fired. There have been people who have faced social consequences, work consequences, stuff like that. So just like, in your own experience, have you gone through any discrimination like that based on your views? Like,
my job is definitely in danger. I think the social justice warriors will probably come after my license as a clinical psychologist. I think there's a reasonable probability. Sure, why not? And I think there's a reasonable probability that I won't have my scientific research funded as well. So yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. And you think, well, those are pretty terrible things, but I'll tell you, they're not as terrible as the consequences of not saying what you think to be the truth. That warps your life, man. That rots your soul. That warps your families. It destroys your communities. It is not something I would recommend. And I do believe this. I know from my studies of mythology and from my extensive experience helping people solve difficult problems, because I've listened to people talk about their problems for 20,000 hours of every sort of problem you can possibly imagine. I've gone through things with people, death and disease and unemployment and depression and schizophrenia and despair and betrayal by family members and the most horrendous things that have happened to people in life. I've walked people through all of that. And one of the things I've learned, and you should listen to this because it's the truth, the worst thing that you can do to someone is to lie to them. You don't lie to people. You don't lie to yourself, because it warps you. It warps the structure of reality itself. And you don't want to do that, because it'll kick back and take you out. So, there's an old story, the story of Noah, and that's a story. The flood story is disseminated all over the world. I have some friends that are Aboriginal that live out on the West Coast, and one of them, who is an illiterate man but knows the mythologies of his people, told me a flood story from their culture. It's the Kwakwaka'wakw culture, that's identical to the flood story in Genesis, except they use a big canoe instead of an ark. But the flood story is a very straightforward story. It says this: now and then human societies become corrupt. They become corrupt because the institutions are outdated and archaic and haven't been updated, but also because people are lying and deceiving each other and being willfully blind and digging and undermining the foundation of their culture. If you do that long enough, what happens is the chaos comes flooding back in and everyone drowns. 40 days and 40 nights of absolute chaos, and hardly anyone survives. It's like, that's what happens when you're deceitful. And that happens to people. Like, look, you get flooded in your life. You get flooded when things turn upside down on you, and the tricks that you're playing on everyone stop working, and you end up flooded. You end up in the underworld where you're suffering, and sometimes you even end up in hell. And you get there by lying. It's a very bad idea. And so, I said at the beginning of this interview that I decided 35 years ago, when I started sorting this sort of thing out, that what I was going to do, I was going to try to live my life in a particular way. And that way was, I wasn't going to use my language to try to get what I wanted. Because maybe I didn't know what I wanted. Maybe I was wrong about that. But what I was going to do instead was tell the truth as clearly as I possibly could and see what happens. That's how you should live. You abandon everything else. You abandon everything but the truth. And you say, I'm going to formulate my words as carefully as I possibly can. I'm going to speak my own fundamental truth, and I'm going to let the world unfold around me however it will, on the assumption that that's the best possible outcome, no matter how it looks to me.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, it is unfortunate that doing something as simple as telling the truth, stating the facts like you have, has become grounds for such drama and controversy.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Right. But
I don't know.
Like you talk about, say the truth and then, see what happens. You're, looking at some of the things your critics are saying, you've been called some pretty terrible things, transphobe, bigot. I think one of your own colleagues from the University of Toronto in your interview called you an abuser of students.
Oh, yeah. No, worse than that. He called me a hate criminal. He did.
How do you respond to that? And why do you think they're so quick to throw these labels out?
When I listen to someone like him, to me, and this has really happened over the last 4 or 5 years, I don't even hear, what I hear speaking is not a person. And I don't mean he's not a person. I do not mean that. I mean that he's possessed by this ideology, just like a medieval person was possessed by a demon. And when I hear ideologues ramble on, all I hear is the chattering of a multitude of demons. And so it has no effect on me, really, because it's just the automatic output of an algorithmic machine. Solzhenitsyn warned people about giving their God-given soul over wholly to human dogma. And that's what I hear. And I mean, I was angry at that particular individual because immediately after the show, he told the host that he hoped that he could get a hold of the transcript of the program so that it could be used in a legal proceeding because Steve Paikin, the host, misgendered one of the participants. And that did make me very angry.
Are you serious?
I am absolutely serious about that, yes. And that made me angry. But I think anger it's the wrong emotion. I mean, it's the wrong emotion because being angry at chattering demons it's not helpful. And to me, it's just noise. It's noise. It's buzzing and confusion. And it's not the person isn't talking to me. I can tell when a person is talking to me because we're having a conversation where we're both striving towards clearer articulation of the truth. Like right now, for example, I'm not trying to convince you or your listeners. That's up to you. I don't want to convince you. I want to get my arguments in order and state them clearly. And you guys can decide for yourself what you want to believe. I'm just telling you what I learned. And if you think I'm wrong and you've got a good argument, you can tell me that I've done something that I shouldn't have done so that I can adjust it. It's like, that makes you my friend. Because you imagine this. I can either try to convince you that I'm right, or while we're talking, I can try to formulate my armament, the tools I use in my life, and a lot of that's articulated statements. I can try to formulate those in a more accurate manner so I can move forward more thoroughly carved and more at the ready. And so you have to speak the truth and listen to the people that are criticizing you so that you can improve the manner in which you're formulating your arguments. And that's the way to live. And look, here's why. Like, as the religious sages have insisted throughout the ages, life is suffering. There's no way around it because human beings are limited and vulnerable, and the universe is a very large place. you're destined to suffer. And so then you might say, well, what defenses do you have against that? And one is the armor of ideology and rightness. But the other is the shield of truth, just like in Sleeping Beauty, when the prince goes off to have combat with the dragon. And truth elevates your life and enriches it. And
well, that is something that I think a lot of people wanted to hear, because I know some comments a lot that I've been getting, in preparation for this, is that people really admire how you're able to keep your calm and, level-headed approach in a lot of these debates and interviews, because, I at least personally would have had trouble keeping as calm as you have when, being called everything that you've been called. So that's really helpful to know. And I appreciate the attempt to contribute to a more constructive dialogue and discourse. It seems like nowadays we can't discuss anything without someone being called a racist or bigoted or prejudiced, which I think is too bad.
Sticks and stones will break my bones, as the old saying goes, but names will never hurt me. So I have one more exercise that your viewers can try. This is, I think, one of the most useful psychological exercises that anyone can ever do. So start with the assumption that many of the things that you say and think aren't yours, and that you don't believe them. They're just things that you've picked up for one reason or another as you've walked through life, and you brandish them like markers of your status. But they're not really you, because what's really you is hard to figure out. So you have to start from that assumption. Then start listening to what you say and feeling what you say as well. And here's the rule. It's a very simple thing to try. Pay attention to whether what you're saying makes you feel stronger or weaker. If it makes you feel stronger, then you can keep saying it. But if it makes you feel weaker, then you should stop saying it. Stop saying it right away. And see if you can reformulate your words so that when you restate them, that feeling of integrity and strength reappears. And you can feel it really down the middle of your body. And because what happens if you're saying something that is untrue is that you dissociate to some degree, because part of you agrees with it and part of you doesn't. It's like you're splitting your psyche.
Like a cognitive dissonance.
It's cognitive, yes. It's very much like cognitive dissonance. And so, but if you pay very close attention to what you say, you can feel yourself coming into alignment if you get the words right. And then when you're in alignment like that, you're centered in your being. And the thing about being centered in your being is that if you're centered in your being, you can withstand suffering without becoming corrupted. And that's what people want when people say they want a meaningful life. That's what they mean. They mean, I want to be somewhere where I can stand powerfully and withstand the onslaught of life with its deaths and its tragedies and all of the things that are associated with it. And you can learn to speak from the bottom of your soul. And if you do that, there's nothing better than that. And
well, you raised a lot of interesting points. And I think one of the interviews I saw when you were with, I think, Rebel Media, you were, I think one of your students mentioned, in your analyses of political views, you found that there was a correlation between PC authoritarianism and I think it was lack of verbal skills or lack of critical thinking or something like that. So when
authoritarian types are comparatively low in verbal ability, so they have no real appreciation for the nuances of language, and they tend to take a very oversimplified view of how argumentation proceeds and even the utility of argumentation.
So in your opinion, if there were to be a greater effort to emphasize maybe critical thinking or verbal reasoning skills in maybe high school, elementary school, and even up to college, do you think that would be maybe a more organic way of combating any future?
Yes. I mean, certainly teaching students to write, which is a very, very difficult thing to learn to do, is that's one of the things that certainly can help people straighten themselves out. And so that's another thing that you can think about. Well, look, I've got these writing programs. They're at a site called selfauthoring.com, SELF authoring, AUTHORING.com, selfauthoring.com. And one of them, the Future Authoring Program, they were designed in my lab as part of an attempt to help people fully articulate their identities in writing. And so what they do is ask people to write out a positive vision for their lives, encompassing their educational aspirations and their career goals and their desire for intimate relationships and their plans for a family and their use of drugs and alcohol and their attempts to take care of themselves mentally and physically. So the idea is put yourself in a meditative state and determine, sorry, just give me 1 sec here.
No problem. You're a popular guy, and I appreciate you giving us as much time as you had.
So, and then imagine what your life could be like in 3 to 5 years if you could set it up so that it was really good for you, like you were taking care of someone that you love. So you'd go through that exercise. You write for 15 minutes after answering some questions about how good your life could be. And that gives you something to aim at, something valuable to aim at that justifies your work and your effort. And then you're asked to write for 15 minutes about how horrible your life could be if you let all your bad habits and foolishnesses and deceits get out of hand. And so then you have a little hell that you know about that you can avoid. So you're motivated to run away from the hell and run towards the heavens, so to speak. And then the program helps people lay out an implementable plan for moving towards the desired state. And we've done research now with several thousand university students, mostly in Europe, but some in Canada. And the program has produced an improvement. It increases the probability that people will stay in university by 25% and raises their grades by 20%. And it works better for the more disenchanted and poorly performing students. So it's had a whopping effect on males, say, compared to females, because males are underperforming females in most places right now in the universities, and a walloping disproportionate effect on ethnic minority students whose performance it has improved radically. So I would also say, if you guys want to do something that'll sort you out and improve your health, mental and physical, and make you more committed to what you're doing, and a more articulated and integrated person, do the future authoring program. It's cheap. We tried to make it the most inexpensive we possibly could, and the results are. We published the results last year in the first study, and we ran it at another college this year. We dropped their dropout rate by 40% in the first semester.
Oh, it
really matters if people think. Yeah, it really matters if you think through your life, and you have a vision of who you could be, and what the world could be like around you. That's what you have to do. And then you have to bend, then you have to develop your character. You have nothing that's more important than your character. And that's the problem with being a materialist. You think that you collect all these things around you, and that's going to protect you from the suffering that's intrinsic to life. That isn't what protects you. It's your character that protects you. If you have your character intact, you can sleep at night with a good conscience, and you can take on the burdens of the day the next morning. And you can live without recrimination and regret. God, there's nothing better than that.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot about morality and all this. So in your opinion, there definitely is a correlation between, I guess, the decay of, I guess, public morality and the rise of social justice then.
Yeah, they're tangled together. They're tangled together inextricably, and one feeds the other.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you about is where do you see the social justice endgame as heading toward? Because right now we're seeing more and more restrictions about, let's say, speech, both in the government and on campuses and different institutions. So do you think they'll stop there, or where will they try to go to next?
Oh, they're going to go after the evolutionary psychologists and the biologists.
So science then.
Oh, definitely. The biology first, yeah. Yeah, they're going to go after the biologists for sure, because I actually think that a certain form of discussion about biological differences is already illegal in Ontario under the provisions of these new laws. People don't
Is that because of the gender biology connection?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I actually from that interview.
Oh, and psychiatrists too. The psychiatrists probably even before the biologists. That's already happening in Ontario.
Right, I remember. Yeah, in the interview you were at, your colleague very adamantly stated that gender or that biological sex was not a fact, I think is what he said.
Yeah, they're going to go after the biologists. So mark my words, biologists, for those of you that are listening, you better wake up, because the social justice warriors are coming for you next. So
that's a terrifying thought. Okay, and I guess one more thing. What can we do to support you specifically? Like, I mean, you said you've got a lot of support, which I think is great. And I do hope your email is just being flooded with messages of support. But what else can we do?
Well, you can support, keep an eye on my YouTube channel, Jordan Peterson Videos. You can sign up there as a Patreon supporter, which would be helpful because I want to devote more and more time to educating people on YouTube, and that would be helpful. It'll help me increase the production quality of my videos, for example. The other thing you can do is just keep an eye on that and my website, jordanbpeterson.com, because we're going to put up this other website where then you can start to contribute, perhaps money, but also perhaps, because we need to build a bit of an organization, but also to upload policy documents and that sort of thing, and to start identifying the people who are behind their generation. And then apart from that, I would say the best thing you can do, and I'm dead serious about this, is bloody well educate yourself. Read those books that I listed on jordanbpeterson.com. Do the future authoring program, because that'll help sort you out and make you strong. And that's the right, like, if you want to support me, the best way to do it is to develop yourself and to take your place in the world as a powerful and forthright citizen and individual. That's what to do. And then you can't be pushed over by weak-kneed mobs of cowards who use compassion as a mask for their resentment and desire to destroy. And that's what they're doing. And it's happened before.
Oh, and I guess, did they ever make you finish that or participate in that HR training?
Oh, no, that was only for HR personnel, but
okay.
We're targeted next. You can bloody well be sure of that. You can also buy these anti-PC stickers if you want. If you go onto my YouTube channel, it tells you how to do that. And I would say, like, it's a trivial thing in a way, but if you bought a dozen of these or 50 of them, I think we're selling packs of 50, you can put them on posters at your institution and just let people know that, not everyone agrees with the sentiments that are being expressed. It's a small thing, but it beats the hell out of nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of why so many people are supporting you, at least why I thought your story was so incredible, is that not only are you doing something that not a lot of people do, which is speak up against the PC culture, but you're also doing it from a position in academia, which is something you don't see at all. I think you're more likely to see a headline about universities engaging in something like censorship or, some crazy social justice policy than you are about any research or, any innovation or discovery, which is really sad, I think.
I would also tell people, tell your parents to stop giving money to universities. Tell them to write their government officials and tell them to stop funding the universities. And go into the trades, do something honorable. Don't go into the humanities, and I would say, with very few exceptions, don't go into the social sciences. If you're going to go to university, go to the STEM disciplines, because they're still not corrupt. It's a horrible thing to say, because I am a great admirer of the humanities. The humanities are the soul of the university, and they're the soul of the culture. But I believe the universities have become corrupted virtually beyond redemption. Mm-hmm. I think I have to go, because I think someone else wants to talk to me. So.
Yeah, I'm sure your phone's ringing off the hook right now. And thank you so much for the time you spent here and for answering all of our questions. We all really appreciate it.
Yep.
And for anyone who's interested in checking out his channel, it is listed in the link below. And as soon as we get off, I'll also post a link to the self-authoring website. And thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to tell us before we sign off?
Nope. Thanks for the opportunity. And don't put up with any nonsense. That's the thing. Don't put up with any nonsense. Remember, like, the people who are doing this are a minority. They're a small minority, and that means that the people that they're after are much more powerful than they think. If enough of us stand up, it'll go away, and it'll go away without conflict. Mm-hmm. And that would be good, because we don't want conflict. We don't want that.
Okay, you guys, you heard him. Stand up for what you believe in. And thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.